So let's begin with a little story. And of course, what I'm going to do now is totally different because of what I've experienced today. But once upon a time there was a hunter. And the hunter was coming down at the end of the day from the forest, trudging across the blue snow back to his hut. And he saw something that chilled him in his bones. It frightened him. What he saw was a thin trail of smoke coming from the hut. So he pads quietly, cautiously across the snow, peers in through the door, and this is what he saw. He saw his knackered old clothes. He's only got a few sets. Someone had washed them and tenderly sewn them back together and just stuck them in a little pile next to the fire that was lit, as the Irish would say, the fire was in keen excitement. And there was a pot of stew. There's not a vegan option for 1,000 miles in Etymology. A proper Yeatsian stew with all those ground herbs, just delicious. Now this touched him deeper than all of Shakespeare. You can imagine such a thing. It touched him deeper than all of Shakespeare. No one had ever been this kind to him before. Next day he comes back, it's the same scene. The day after that, it's the same scene again. So by the end of the week, he does what you or I would have probably done immediately, which is he doubles back and comes back early. Peers through the door of the hut, and this is what he sees. In fact, he doesn't just see it, he beholds it, which is a big romantic move. He sees that there is a woman cooking the food. He sees that she has a torrent of red hair down her back, right to her waist. And he knows in the way that hunters know that this is fox woman dreaming. This is part woman, part spirit, and some old presence it is difficult for us to talk about. And she knows in the way that all women know when they're being watched. So she turns, she doesn't miss a beat, and she looks at him and she says, I will be the woman of this hut. And he looks at her and he says, yeah. So that night, I mean, picture the scene. The two of them are eating together. There's just a little stubby waxy candle. Maybe there's a bottle of wine from somewhere. But they talk together, they laugh together, they tell jokes together. And slowly, 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 as the troubadours would say, the ecstatic woman that stands behind her and the ecstatic man that stands behind him show up and start to gaze at each other. We should be so lucky. We're all a little jealous to this day. And that night, in the slow time, when they make love together, the very edges of the hut and the dark green blue pines of the forest, they commingle. Just like that. So, from then on, it's a great scene. It's a happy scene in the hut. But you've got to know something about fox women. You probably know this already. All fox women, looking round the room at least 40 of them, all fox women have a pelt. And this pelt usually, traditionally, hangs off the door of the hut. And any of you rural characters, again of which there are some here, will know about foxes that once or twice a year they deliver a strong, how will I phrase this, regal scent. It's not domestic. And after a while, the foxwoman's pelt starts to give off its regal scent. Now for a while, the hunter tries to cope with it, but you know that scent, it's getting into his clothes, it's getting into his head, it's getting into his traps. He can't function right with the scent of the pelt in the hut. So over dinner, he says something like this. Bright pulse of my whole understanding. This is how you plump someone up in fairy tale language. Bright pulse of my whole understanding, sky woman of the dawn, blossoming branch. You are a ship in full sail on a mistless wave. You were whiter than the swan on the pool. When I saw you, I thought the moon herself had fallen from a bed of wild flowers and had fallen down in front of me and was singing an old tune I had waited my whole life to hear. But there's just this one thing. It's the pelt. If you could just consider getting the pelt out of the hut, it would just make life so much easier. I'm not telling you we should burn it. I'm not even telling you that the pelt is bad. I just feel, for the two of us, we should put the pelt back further out into the forest. I mean, you've lived through this. And she looks, and there's that glitter of her green eyes, and she says nothing. Months pass, until finally the scent has got so pervasive and the pelt has gone nowhere, that now all sweetness, all charm, all elegance has fallen dead from his mouth. And he says, look, I told you once before, get rid of the pelt. And she hears that. She hears that. And in the morning, when the hunter wakes, the woman is gone, and the pelt is gone, and the scent is gone. And they say truly that the hunter stands to this day lonely in his whole body at the entrance of the hut for the scent of the fox woman. I have an odd feeling about that old fairy tale. And I don't want to say too much about it. It's too wonderful to say too much about. But I can't help feeling in the West, we sent the fox woman into exile a long time ago. So whatever happens tonight, I'd like to say this about it before we begin, before we find out what kind of trouble we're going to get in. I would say this. I can't remember at this stage in my life whether I'm a mythologist or a storyteller or anything. All I know is that I am singing across the blue snow to the fox woman. So, you know, in the old Gaelic world, to teach used to be, it's very similar to the word to sing over. So maybe this will be a kind of singing that's going to happen. Maybe this is for the fox woman. So my name is Martin Shaw. I used to live in Canterbury, actually, back in the day. And we were having a conversation today about the sacrality of places, special, potent, powerful places. And we were talking about the distinction, or not the distinction, but saying, why is it maybe sometimes Canterbury, such a seat of pilgrimage, doesn't quite kind of hum with the holy, as well as some other places we could name in Great Britain? Well, even 20 years ago, I could feel this. So I got a job that meant I had to work in the middle of the night. Do you remember this, Tom? My brother is here, by the way. I had a job as a cleaner. I think it's in one of the art colleges. And what I learnt about Canterbury is that Canterbury really has what you could call day intelligence and night intelligence. And Canterbury wants to disclose something to you at night that it cannot show its hand in the daytime. So I wasn't expecting to say that, but pay attention to this city at night. And if you can, make a practice of sitting outside as it gets dark, dusk, what we call in Devon the Dipsy time. Go out in the Dipsy time and allow that delicious melancholy to come through you. So I am here tonight to talk a little bit about this phrase, Romanticism as activism. And I don't have the time, but I wish I do, to talk about what I regard as the word romantic. It's a problematic word to some people, but I think it's an important word for the times we're living in. And I am here absolutely and unequivocally in defense of not just beholding, but making beauty. Actually making it. The craft of making it. In all the old fairy tales, whenever they mention gold, it's not about accumulated wealth through violence. It's about something that you have crafted by hand with labour over time to something that is bigger than yourself. And we're living in funky times, are we not? over the last few months. So fairy tales for me are a romantic, radical way of a substantial form of imagination. An imagination that we were discussing today is bigger than just our neurosis, is bigger than just our fantasy, but is actually something that touches the thinking of the earth itself. So the stories that I'm going to tell, I hope, are not stories about the earth. That's too abstract for me. I hope they are stories where briefly and occasionally the earth itself speaks through them, radiates something through the images. But where that'll be and how that'll happen, I do not know. Long before I became a storyteller, and the reason I'm a storyteller is that I had ended up on a mountain that many of you will know well in Snowdonia called Cadair Idris, or very near it actually. And I spent 4 days and nights fasting out in a wild place, just like the old fairy tales. And you will know, I bet, about Cadair Idris. They say, do they not, if you spend a night on Cadair, you will come down mad, dead, or a poet. So I spent 4 days and nights just to make absolutely sure. And what happened out there was difficult, troublesome, boring, and occasionally terrifying. Occasionally terrifying. You know, the wilderness has teeth. You can die very quickly out there. Towards the end of the experience, I moved into a state which Aboriginal teachers will call wildland dreaming. And wildland dreaming is not hard in a way to articulate and is incredibly difficult in another way to talk about. But it's this moment that you will have glimpsed in your own lives, I'm sure, where for a period of time you realise, I'm not thinking anymore, I'm getting thought. I'm getting thought. There's a difference. That's where the really substantial stories, you realise, I'm getting thought. This story is having its way with me. It's not an allegory. It's not something I can control necessarily. I'm not making a psychological point with it. I'm getting thought. So I got thought, and then of course I'm catapulted back into southeast London to a culture that has not just amnesia of that kind of experience, but active hostility to it. Active hostility. And I recognised that these old indigenous rites of passage, which many of you will be familiar with, think of something like a vision quest. In the old days, the period of greatest vulnerability was when you were out on the mountain, when you were listening to the lament of the dead, when you could be consumed by a mountain lion. That was the dangerous bit. And then you came back to the warm, troublesome blessing of the people, your village, your community, that understood what you had been through, and that you were adding a little bit to the magic of that place, that relationship between the village and the forest. So I come back to London, and of course none of that is waiting, and I realise that I'm in a more dangerous position in London than I ever was up the mountain. So I took myself off, and for 4 years I lived in a black tent on a succession of English hills to try and do what Seamus Heaney, beautiful phrase by Heaney, I tried to tune my ear. I recognised my ear was out of tune to the earth, the living earth. It wasn't tuned right. So I cleared a lot out of the way. Thank God this is just before the internet and just before all of that business. So, you know, off I went. And the problem I had was probably a problem you faced in your own life. And it's very simple. When you have been through something profound and difficult, so think of an illness or a divorce or something that absolutely pulls you away from the life you're expecting to have, what is available in language or in art or in some form of expression to communicate that, but give it a little bit of dignity, so it's more than just a splurge? Is this making any sense? So you're not living all over everybody. That's a good phrase. You're not living over everybody with your particular pain and duress. But how traditionally, what are the techniques for articulating deep material? To use a big word, you know, movements of the soul. And the thing at that point that magically rescued me was the stories I loved as a kid. I grew up in a house without a television and a phone, and it wasn't a kind of cultural choice, it was poverty really. But I grew up around stories. Language was regarded as wealth. Language was wealth, and I realised when I came back from the mountain that my language was very damaged. The way that I spoke was damaged. So I'm living in this little tent, and every day I'm looking over this valley in the Cotswolds, and I would look at weather patterns, and I would look at the movement of the stag and the badger, and I longed to find in language something, a form of communication that was so old it could carry weather patterns and old gods and little rivers and broken-hearted women. All of it could live in the language. So we go to Lorca, we go to Emily Dickinson, we go to Ted Hughes, we go to Yeats. But really I went to stories. Because stories were a way that I could talk, I could touch upon everything I'm touching upon here without ever speaking of it explicitly. Is that making sense? So in other words, you could come into a room and say, forgive me anybody that's German, I am here to speak of the mother complex. I could do that, or I could say, once upon a time there was a castle surrounded by a great forest, and we're in. Suddenly, something has its arms round the whole room that is big and mighty and old and interested in us. And that's what I think stories are going to do. So what I'm going to do in a minute is tell a story, and then what I'd really like to do is hear a little bit from you, a very simple thing I'm going to ask. It's like a couple of words. I'm going to say, where do you find yourself in the story? The understanding being that following the story from beginning to end and it all making sense is absolutely, totally not the point. In fact, the older cultures that you go to, you begin to find that many of the ways the stories, when you're often with Aboriginal storytellers, the story doesn't begin in the same place over and over again. It arrives that day depending on the medicine that needs to be given out in the room. Because stories are a form of health, You have stories for your kidney, stories for your liver, stories for your shoulder. It's efficacious. So when I'll say to you, where do you find yourself in this story? It's a very simple thing. You just say, I'm asleep in a hollow tree. Or, I am the raven over the barley. Whatever it is. But I promise you this, that is your acupuncture point. That's your pressure point into the story. And if I came back in a year and told the same story again, which is always good with storytelling, repetition, I would be very surprised if you were in the same place. So I'm going to do that in like 2 minutes. Yes?
Might we dim the lights for the story?
If you can make the lights look any better than this strip-lit horror, I'd be thrilled. Perfect!
It might be all or nothing, isn't it?
Is that better for you? Slightly less pain? All right. Okay, so I promise I'm going to tell this story, but just before, I've written 3 books over the last 10 years called the Mythteller trilogy, and they are primarily this is what they're about. They're about the landscape of a myth and the myth of a landscape, the mythology of a landscape and the landscape of a mythology. Very often when I'm travelling around, and I teach at Stanford and other places, I notice that myth tends to get co-opted in universities immediately into the psychology department. That's where it goes. They regard myth as, this is how old ancient people thought psychologically. It's absolutely, totally not true. It's not true. And I will go in the ring on this issue, and have frequently. That's not to demean psychological thinking. I talk with, Hillman and others, and I love all of that. But we talked today a little bit about deconstruction, didn't we? Well, the wonderful thing about myth doesn't make things smaller, it makes things bigger. You're more trouble. There's more trouble. Your life will get more complicated. If you take anything I say seriously, your life will not be simple. But you will learn to relish the complexity. So I wrote these 3 books, seeing what kind of trouble I could get into, and I was working 4 jobs, and I was a young dad, and there was no audience, and I'm always amazed there's anybody here. But the final book, called Scatterlings, which I just have these are really almost the first copies in the country. I've had them for a couple of months, really. This is a book which is walking effectively the geography of 7 Dartmoor stories over 4 winters. So what I wanted to do was this. I wanted to find stories that were very specifically about a place. Not nomadic stories, but stories that mentioned in them, you know, the oak tree with the moss on the northern flank on the side of Venford River. And what I did was I walked the geography of the stories across the moors, usually through pretty serious weather. And the commentary on the stories, as well as being theoretical, is basically what happened on the walk. What happened on the walk? Did I fall into reverie? Did I fall into a river frequently? Did I get lost? Yes. That kind of thing. And this is the book. And I owe it to myself to read a couple of paragraphs for it before we go somewhere else entirely. It's about looking for language. And we talked briefly about etymology today and the fact that, you know, some etymology is simply made up. But I believe Gaston Bachelard has this wonderful, wonderful thing that he says. He says, the earth wants to be admired by you. Isn't that gorgeous? Every day that you wake up, your garden is like, check me out. And all we have to do is make the romantic move from seeing to beholding. Seeing to beholding. It's Blake. Blake finds everything he needs in London. You and I are looking at a thistle, but Blake says, that's not a thistle, that's a little grey man, and he's waving at me. So what could we find could we make a weather pattern blush? Yeah. Could we charm a rowan tree 12 different ways so it just curls its leaves a little bit? So looking for that kind of language is what I'm talking about here. This is living in the tent, really. I went looking for stories in dark places, in caves hundreds of foot into the base of Welsh hills, the immensity of tree root and stones suspended above my fragile head. I learnt slow words down there, words flush deep with water and boulder vast. I took myself to dreaming places, forgotten places, places deserving of shrines. I built small shelters in ancient solitary haunts and sealed myself into the dark for days and nights. It was in those places I learnt many holy names for time. Time as malleable as a concertina, as robust as Irish cattle, as slippery as the trout escaping the hook. Each of the secret words was wealth for my parched tongue. They required payment in full, and I was not sad to give it. They required payment in full, and I was not sad to give it. So Scatterlings is that book, and there's a few copies here. So are you ready for a story? Okay, that was appalling. So what we're going to do is we're going to recalibrate your enthusiastic response. So imagine that underneath. Well, this is. You see, we're so impoverished, and don't take that personally. We're so impoverished in the business of storytelling. It's not just my imagination in the room right now. It's yours. And you know the images, kids, of the magic carpet. We've all got to get on the magic carpet. And the way we're going to do it actually is. We're going to do an old gypsy way of calling a story into the room. I'll say, shall we go? And you're going to say, let's go. And I'm going to do it 3 times. Then you're going to hear the drum. And by the way, the drum is going to be a lament of the dead. And everybody that you ever loved as a child is going to turn up behind you. So just be ready for that. And then we're going to tell an old Eastern European fairy tale that is telling you exactly about what is happening in the world at this point. And then I'll ask you, how did you find it? So you don't know clappy clappy at the end. Shall we go?
Let's go!
Shall we go?
Let's go!
Shall we go?
Let's go!
Not bad. So think of this as the hooves of a horse. know who isn't here tonight could really do with hearing a story. So hold them in your heart as this story comes into the room. Inside you, there are many kingdoms. And surrounding those kingdoms, there are blue-green forests and snowy-tipped mountains. Underneath those mountains, there are meadows filled with wild flowers erupting from the earth like cups of honey. And in a place and a time like that, inside you there is a king and there is a queen. Now I have to tell you about the king and the queen. The good news is that they were loved by their people. Everybody had met them. Everybody had felt their confirming gaze. The old poets would say they were rivers to their people. Magnificent, so generous. They were rivers to their people. But at night, when the feasting of the day had finished, when the king and queen went back to their chambers, there was a grief that lived between them. And the grief was this: they could not conceive a child. They tried, nothing's happening. Now when the queen was carrying that kind of grief in her, the place she used to go was the great forest that surrounded the castle to the north, the south, the east and the west. And one day she's out in the forest wandering around, and out from behind a tree comes a little old woman. Now you know it's a fairy tale when their head's bobbing. So there was a bit of bobbity bob going on. And the old woman looked at the queen and she said, you know, I can see in my old witchy way all the grief you are curating in your heart, all the hidden chambers I can see into. Is it true that your deepest longing is for a child? And she says it is. And she says, what kind of language have you given your longing? And she said, well, none at all. Ah, there's the rub, said the old woman. You have not given full voice to your desire. This is what you must do. Take a little cup from the kitchen, one that you can hold like this, and I want you to walk out into the gardens, walk to the northwest part, and speak out loud the deepest longings of your heart, the harayas of your heart, the yearnings of your heart. When you get to the northwest place, and you do this at dusk, the Dimpsey time, breathe your longings into the cup, turn the cup over and press them onto the dark soil. In the morning you shall return to the cup. You will pick the cup up, and underneath it is a red flower and a white flower. The white flower is a very good flower. All its chakras are balanced. It's organic. There's a little blue light above it. If you eat the white flower, nothing but good, calm, temperance can come into your life. It's a wonderful thing. Eat the white flower. Now the red flower, that is a whole other game. That flower is the Johnny Cash of flowers. That flower is calorific, tastes vaguely of barbecue and whiskey and Sundays holding the hard cards of repentance. That's what the red flower is like. So you're going to stay away from that. You're going to eat the white flower. Have I made myself absolutely clear, says the bobbing lady. Yes, you have, says the Queen. What could possibly go wrong? And with that, the old bobbing lady disappears into the forest. Well, sure enough, come the Dimpsey time, down she goes into the garden. She's got her cup. She's singing. She's muttering her longing. She puts it into the cup. She puts it down in the northwest place. She goes back to bed. And in the morning, of course, she's elbowing her husband. She's going, come on, let's check this out. So they go down to the little cup, they open it, and just as the old woman had said, there is a red flower and there is a white flower. Why do we do this? Why do we do this? I think in the Quran it says, when you die your hands will testify against you. Blake says it too. Your hands will say, I went places I shouldn't have gone. And your groin will say, me too. So you're reaching for that white flower, that redemptive flower. You're reaching, you're reaching, you're reaching, you're re. I've never felt so alive! Bugger! What's she done? She's eaten the red flower, hasn't she? I think that's crystal clear at this point. Now the husband has seen his wife like this before. And he says, my love. Like Prince Charles, my love. Give me that. That's being recorded. Look, no one needs to know. No one should know you had the red flower. If you eat the white flower, something good will happen and we'll just forget about the red one. And she looked at him and became oddly Scottish. She said, you shall tell no one of what has transpired here today. Capiche? And he said, I shall not. And all husbands in the room, he never did. So she consumes the white flower and she feels down in the lonely croft of her hips some little spark of light. Wake up. And she knows that she is indeed pregnant. 9 months pass and it is time for the child to be born. She is in some strange little room. It is dark, there's rain lashing down. It's a kind of little tunnel, not a tunnel, a tower, I mean. And all the midwives are there and the doulas are there. And you know, the oldest of the doulas was very, very small. They would get her out of a matchbox. But she can peer into areas denied to most of us because she's so small. And all you students of divination, she is staring into the scrying bowl of the woman's vagina. See, if you remember nothing from the scene, just that. She is staring into the scrying bowl of the woman's vagina, and she says, "Oh, she's got a stew. Oh, there's something coming down the chute! There's something coming down the chute! Everybody get back!" And then suddenly, shooting out from between the woman's legs, is a little slippery black snake. No one sees it but the doula, and the doula grabs it and she immediately, in a protective mode, throws the black snake out of the window, into the rain, into the forest, into the night. 2 minutes later, a beautiful little boy is born, and the little black snake is not mentioned again. It is an old Gnostic secret that on the night you were born, you had a twin. And the same thing happened. They were thrown out of the window. And it is the business, I hear, of making yourself into an adult, that you go out and find that wild twin that culture at large wants you to forget. That's not the story. So the little boy grows up, he's a jolly little chap, time but he's a sweetie. And he gets to that age where he says, he comes to see his mum and dad and he says, look, I've got needs. I've got a lot of love to give. And I need to start giving. And they said, you, Balthazar, it's time you married. And he says, yes, that's absolutely definitely what should happen. So you will go out on your horse, you will go around the local valleys and the fields, and you will meet all the women of the area, and you will find out if someone is willing to become your wife. And he said, yes, absolutely, I'll pack my sandwiches, frappuccino, I'm off. So he does it. Remember the horses? He sets out. He has not been going too long in the forest before he comes to a crossroads, and blocking the crossroads is an enormous and ferocious black serpent. black shiny scales, black eyes, steam from its nostrils, and it says this: older brothers marry first! Sensibly, he changes direction on his horse and heads off somewhere else into the forest. All day long, every crossroads he comes to is the black serpent. Older brothers marry first, older brothers marry first, older brothers marry first. Sometimes in our life, there is only one place we're going to go, only one thing we are destined to experience. So he goes back to his mum and dad, and he says, is there anything you need to tell me? Anything at all? Search the memory banks. And they said, okay, well, what's the problem? And he says, there's this great black serpent in the forest that says older brothers marry first. Does this ring any bells? And they said, no. But the little doula, if we brought her a thimbleful of brandy, which she likes, and one of Fidel Castro's cigars, maybe she, just a tiny puff, maybe she'll have something to say about it. So they go and they see the little lady in the, it's a matchbox, isn't it? Mm. And they open up the matchbox and she's there. And they say, do you know anything, did anything else happen before little Balthazar was born? And she says, no, yes, no. And they said, oh, rewind. There was a yes. And she says, well, there was that little black snake, but I did not think it appropriate in such times to mention it. And they said, well, what did you do with it? And she said, well, I sent it into exile. I threw it out into the darkness and the rain. Now it's come back absolutely terrifying and serious. And they said, aha, okay, that is the black serpent. You have a black serpent brother, a twin, in fact. At this point, the king and queen do something remarkable. They did not send men to go out and try and kill the serpent. They said this: we must make a room in our house for the serpent. It's extraordinary. We must make a room in our house for the serpent. And the only way we will be able to call the serpent back into our midst is with music and with poetry and fine language. So they don't go out with their bayonets and their arrows and their shields and their swords. They go out with fine words. They go out with musical instruments. And slowly, this great slouching beast makes its way into the castle, into the room they've repaired. There's lots of sort of ripped up newspapers and some straw everywhere. And this great being comes in and just sits there brooding, but saying the same thing: older brothers marry first. So they figure out, they think, well, we've got to get him married off. How do we diplomatically describe this new prince that's arrived to make him attractive? So they there's the local newspaper and they put in a thing, and it's, dark brooding prince discovered. So the ladies are thinking of Jim Morrison. They're not thinking of the being, the great serpent. Is anybody interested in marrying a dark, complicated man who's immensely wealthy? And they're like, oh, what's this? That bit of a challenge. And so a woman emerges who says, I absolutely will marry this man. So she turns up at court. They take her around, they show her the feasting halls, they show her the sculleries, they show her the great elegant gardens. They even take her to the sounding halls where the poets compose from the scarred ballads of language. She sees it all. And then finally she's taken into a very, very dark room where there is the priest, low-lit candles, and this enormous black slumbering shape. And as she walks up to the priest, this tail just comes out of the dark and wraps itself 3 times around her legs. And she looks into the darkness and says, I do. She disappears off, and in the morning there's a few bones scattered around the place and a slightly more content serpent saying, older brothers marry first. Get me another one. Now this is a repetitive pattern, as you will be suspecting, because it's a fairy tale, and it happens another 11 times. Well, by now, you know what communities are like, villages are like. Word is out about the dark, complicated prince. And it's slowed down the level of applications to be his queen. Nobody comes in. In fact, it's called the castle you go into and never come out. So they're all surprised when word comes from the edge of the kingdom that a young woman, the daughter of a shepherd, has agreed to marry the being that lives, in the dark room. But she says this: I want 1 year and 1 day to prepare, because I ain't going in as a kid to a situation like this. I want a year and a day. Well, they're so thrilled anybody's volunteered. They said, yes, we'll put him on hold till then. Now, the young woman, the daughter of the shepherd, rather like the queen, would take her questioning, her wondering, out into the forest. So she's walking around thinking, I've signed up to marry this dark prince, and I haven't really got a plan. I'm just buying myself some time with this year and a day. When suddenly, from out of an oak tree, walking directly out of the oak, is an old woman with that little bobbing head. And the old woman said this: I salute your bravery in this attempt of marriage. However, you need the old binding instructions of a real crone, and I'm going to tell you how you enter a room with a serpent. You, she's talking to the young girl, you are to craft by hand 12 wedding dresses. Not wedding dresses you wear, like night dresses. That's the way I describe it. And these beautiful dresses you will wear at night, all 12 of them, and you will spend a lot of time sewing around the area of your chest, around the area of your heart. This is what the troubadours call the educated heart. It's what in the old Celtic world, when you do this in a fairy tale, you are weaving your life to the other world. It's a religious practice. You're weaving your life to the other world. You will do this 12 times. The night you marry him in the chamber, not only will you go in like the Michelin Man with all these dresses on, you will have a bath of milk in the corner, and you will have another bath of lye, which is like water and ashes. It's an old symbol of grief. And you will have 2 metal scrubbing brushes. And you're going to do with them, I can't tell you that yet. So she says, okay, and the old bobbing lady goes back into the tree and disappears. All year long in the forest, the young woman just moves her needle in and out like the sighing of the tides. The dresses are made, the wedding, the night dresses. The wedding comes, she turns up. Now they don't even bother taking her around the castle. There's no sort of trip. Right? It's like, come on. They take her into the room, and there, of course, is the great being. But guess what she did? She looked into the slumbering darkness. She looked at the scales. She looked at the steam from the nose. She said, oh, that's my husband. That's powerful. That's my husband. No hysteria. No hysteria. No naivety. That's my husband. Where do I sign? Right. Okay. And she signs it, and the that tail wraps itself 3 times around her. She sort of warmly strokes the scales, and they go off to the bedroom together. Now the serpent thinks he knows what's going to unfold. So he says what he always says. He says, let's go to bed. Take off your dress. And she looks at him and says, I will take off 1 of my dresses if you take off 1 of your sets of scales. And he looks, He looks in the way a man looks when they've been exiled for 20 years. And he says, no one ever asked me to do that before. I'll do it. Now that is a painful business. For those of us that have taken off a layer of scales, it hurts. But after a while, the bloody business is done. That scales are off. Of course, there's other scales underneath. There's always more. And he says, I did it. Now take off your dress. She takes it off, and of course, there's another one. And he says, oh, take that one off too. And she says, I will take off one of my dresses if you take off one of your sets of scales. He says, oh, bugger, I've heard about this. It's called a courtship, isn't it? Yeah, it is. No, jog on. Come on. Get it happening. Well, you're going to know that this difficult St. John of the Cross type moment goes on pretty much all night long. I don't know when it was the last time you went through something like this, but you're not looking your best, are you? Once you've had 12 layers of scales willfully pulled off you. And underneath the scales was not the most beautiful man that ever been. There's just a great blubbery worm, which is what we usually look like after an experience like this. Not Clark Gable down there, there's no Clooney. There's just this worm, this awful, awful worm. And she says, okay, well, you know, she's just got her one little shift on now, because she is secretly, by the way, she's secretly the yellow breast of the moon. She's secretly the moon. She's not like the moon, she is the moon. And that's when she gets the scrubbing brushes out. Do you remember them? The metal scrubbing brushes. And she puts the scrubbing brushes into the water with all of those ashes and that lie in it. And she starts to scrub, scrubbity scrub the worm. And if he thought the scales coming off her, the blubbery business underneath is a whole other language of uncomfortability. Is that a word? Is this the moment? Have I just made a word? Uncomfortability in its fullness. Scrub. Ah! Now underneath that is a man. Not the most beautiful man there ever was. Simply a man with the face of someone that's been out in the woods for a long time. I don't know if it's a wild face or a feral face or a heartbroken face. I don't know what it is. Only you know that face. But it is then and in that place that she carries him to the bath of milk. And he climbs in very, very gently. She cleans him with the milk of the moon. Golden apples of the sun, silver apples of the moon. And some great healing, which is difficult to talk about, lived between the man and the woman. Now the thing is, we all now know what is going on in that room, but no one in the castle does. So they turn up expecting the bones, of course, and they open the door and they're kind of, you know, they're like this, they're waiting for it, and what they find is a young man and a woman sitting up in bed, you know, reading the Norwegian Times, little cafetiere, orange juice, and as the Irish say, all were in radiant contentment. All were in radiant contentment. All were in radiant contentment. And they said, well, it looks like you figured out some stuff we could all do with knowing about in here. And they said, for sure. And they said, you know, that wedding we had last night, that wasn't much of a wedding. And this is a fairy tale. So surely we should have another wedding. And this time, it should be a wedding with music and laughter and card games and wrestling and outrageous boasts, profuse weeping. We should call in everybody from the village. We should call in Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. We should call in Van Morrison. We should call in Frida Kahlo. We should call in Patti Smith. Oh my God! That is John Coltrane climbing through the back window with Carl Jung. That is Rudolf Steiner with a bottle of brandy. Everybody is dancing. Everybody is singing. It's the kind of wedding that goes on for 3 days. You're so exhausted, you fall asleep, you get up and you do it again. Idle boasts become beautiful boasts, and your tongue is moved to eloquence. That is the wedding that is happening inside us right now. And in the middle of the dance floor is the woman of the educated heart and the man that learned to shed his scales. And as long as they keep dancing, the world as we know it cannot come to an end. Because all storytellers know that the end of a story, the tale of a story, jumps back into the mouth of its beginning. And that's why the world can't end. It is Christmas, and we are walking through the woods to the feast. It is Christmas, and we are walking through the woods to the feast. So all of this is going on inside us all the time. And that is why it's so hard to meditate. That's what they tell me, that's what I hear, and that is all I know. Communitas. You feel that deepening. When you're ready, feel where you are in all those images. And if there's a moment that has claimed you, just speak it out. It's a way of being sweet to the story after it's worked hard for us. Where do you find yourself in that tale? Right, gigglers. Please.
Reaching for the red flower.
Oh.
I knew it. Trouble at mill. Reaching for the red flower.
Yeah.
Speaking into the cup.
Speaking into the cup. Yeah, that yearning. So,
The painful scrubbing in the lye bath.
the painful scrubbing in the lye bath. Yeah.
In the river that was the love of the king and queen.
In the river that was the love of the king and queen. That's good.
Sewing the night
Pulling.
dresses.
Okay, sewing the night dresses.
Pulling off layers of scales.
Pulling off layers of scales. Oh,
Painfully.
Still an unmarried son.
pardon?
There's still an unmarried son.
There is still an unmarried. Thank you, sir. That's only been commented on twice in the many times. But there is. He's still out there. Ladies, keep your eyes out. Oh, what's he called? Balthazar, isn't it? He's never been Balthazar before. That's called the oral tradition, by the way. He'll never be called Balthazar again. Anyone else?
I was on the horse.
You were on the horse.
Yeah.
Mm.
I wanted to be on the horse. That was the other image that stuck with me.
I was in the crystal. Yeah.
Oh, lots of horses.
You beat me to it when you said the red flower.
Looking into the eyes of the
Yeah, into the eyes of the broken mountain. Now, we won't do it now, but one of the most interesting things to do with a story like that that's fairly short, although I can teach you for 2 days, is to do a thing where we get a little group, and before you've had time to Google it, before you've had time to listen to a recording, we just say, what just happened? Tell the story back to each other, just like you're in a bar. You know, you got a pint of Guinness, and you're going, what? There was this thing, and then. Now, what starts to happen is what medievalists call the sense and the matter of a story. Now, the matter of the story is the nuts and the bolts. UFOs. It's the once upon a time there was a king and a queen and they could not conceive a child. So the story has already told us in a couple of lines that the centre of power has become impotent. The old ways do not work. Fairy tales are incredibly compressed information. Incredibly compressed. So straight away we know that something has lost its fertility at the very centre of things. Now in the Grail tradition and many other stories, I would say to you, the barley is bent in the field, the trout lies with her eggs rancid in her belly on the side of the silvery stream. So you know that some old arrangement between sovereignty and the land is in crisis. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. The matter of it's the this. However, the sense of the telling is what you and you bring to it the first time you tell it. Which is why storytellers insist, I always tell it the same way, but you never tell it the same way twice, not unless it's a recital. Because the story has something to disclose through you that I can't know about. And stories, I would suggest, also are a little bit like recipes passed down in a family. You know what it's like, this is the way that Aunt Agatha made chicken soup, and this is the way everybody made chicken soup, and then one day you discover smoked paprika, and you put that little bit in, that small thing, that is, it's just a little bit of a signature. That's where the artistry is in storytelling. If you go out and find other versions of this story, which by the way is called the Lindworm, it's called the Lindworm, W-U-R-M, and it's a story, this version actually you find in Yorkshire, but you also find it in, lots of parts of Eastern Europe. But look for the sense and the matter. So maybe try and tell it within the next 7 days before you know too much about it. My advice would be this: let the story have its way with you. The stories are essentially promiscuous. They leap from bed to bed and they get into all kinds of mischief. But there's something it wants to say that I don't know too much about. But I turned up this evening having no clue what story I was going to tell. And the fact that this one has shown up is something to do with the commingling of our imaginal at the moment. And I really don't know what that is. It's the difference maybe between pastoral stories and prophetic stories. They do different things in us. And you need both at different times. If we do nothing else in that position of gratitude, it's why at the end of the weddings I'm saying, remember everybody you loved as a child. Remember what James Joyce calls aesthetic arrest. Remember the moments when your soul is claimed, because we are less likely to have our imagination colonized if we retain that, if we remember what we love. It's like, talk about saving the earth, talk about that particular copse, talk about that particular stretch of river. Tom Waits, the musician, he's got a great phrase. He says every song needs an address. You can't care about a song unless it's got an address in it. Something happens, or there's a name. Do you know what I mean? You go, of course, So anyway, that's what I think about that. So look, thank you very much for coming. I hope I see you down the road. There are some books here, and bless you. All right.
Thank you.